Hello, and welcome to Research the News. Today, we're going to be exploring the foster care system. Now, as some background, this system does have noble intentions. The goal is to protect children from abuse, provide temporary homes, and keep kids with their families when possible. But that last point has become a point of contention between some advocates, and we'll talk a little about that today. But currently, there are over 400,000 children in foster care in the US, and kids ages 1 to 5 make up about 30%, which is the largest share. And recently, I watched a documentary called Foster, and it was heartbreaking. The kids talk about abuse, about being abandoned and having no one that cared for them, and not knowing if they'd ever be loved. There were kids who had been in 15 to 20 homes and called every person they lived with mom and dad, and then they left those parents again. There were kids who had to sit in court and say that their mom abused them in order to not return home, but who had to look their mom in the eyes while on the stand and couldn't do it out of fear. And there was even one child who watched his mother's boyfriend kill his mother. All of this leads to some of the outcomes we see after a child leaves foster care. 1 in 4 experience homelessness from ages 19 to 21, and 1 in 5 are incarcerated in that same age bracket. But to me, the worst part of the documentary was that these are the stories that are able to be told in public. So what does it look like off camera, and how can the system be improved? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And as always, there'll be no edits to the podcast. We're just going to have some conversation and see where it takes us. And with that, let's start the show. All right, so today we actually have 2 guests on the show, and I'm going to do a little introduction for them now. First up, we have Dr. Jennifer Jacobs, who has served in the Army as a West Point graduate and as a former White House fellow. She studied physics and nuclear engineering and then decided to use knowledge she gained there to launch a family connection software tool to help change the way foster children find a home. And we also have Renee Williams, who's the executive director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And she stepped into the role after serving as the director of the National Crime Victim Bar Association. And she mentors through Big Brothers Big Sisters, and in her free time, advocates for children as a court-appointed special advocate. And remember, if you dislike what any of us say here today, just keep on listening, because hopefully you'll understand what we're trying to say. So first off, I want to talk a little about interesting career transitions. Both of you come from college backgrounds that don't seem to relate fully to what you're doing now. And Jennifer, can you tell us a little bit about switching from physics and nuclear engineering to family connection software?
Sure. It really makes more sense than you'd think. So I did spend quite a few years using my physics and my nuclear engineering background. After the Army, I spent most of my adult career in nuclear nonproliferation and counterterrorism. And in that field, I intersected with the intelligence community. They do what turns out to be a very similar process steps to mapping out family connections around a foster child. They're doing it around terrorist networks. And it grabs data and sucks it in, organizes that data, massive amounts of information that need to be visualized and managed. And they have some really cool software to help them do it. So about 10 years ago, I was reading an article about foster care, kind of like you were watching that documentary the other day. That was my entry into this transition. And in the article I was reading, it talked about how specialists in the foster care space look to build networks around a child, find all the people that they're connected to in one way or another. And as I was reading it in my mind, I was visualizing this intelligence software I was familiar with. And I thought, well, it's the same thing. And so then I started to research more. They must have some software to help them do this. It's a really hard problem. And I found out they didn't. And over time, met a woman who became my co-founder. She herself spent time in foster care. And we just decided it was important that people doing this work who are serving our most vulnerable children should be supported with the best resources we can find. So we decided to make that pivot. She also was not a social worker. She was a communications person, and launched that. And the other key decision we made was that the software would be free, so that it wasn't, so that we could remove the obstacle of money and contracts for users, and we could just put these resources out there.
I love it. And Renee, tell me about switching from theater arts to law school and now working with victims of crime and kids who are going through the system.
Well, I'm in the same camp as Jennifer. It really makes more sense than it appears to on the surface. And I'll give a little shout out for theater majors first. Theater majors, when you're a serious theater major, as of course I was, it's not just kind of getting in front of a camera. You really research how people were, how people think, what they thought, and that allows you to become a character. So it's much more than just reading a script, and it's really reading constantly, and it's almost a study in history. Especially if you want to become a dramaturgist, which I was interested in doing. So it's understanding the past, it's understanding why people make the decisions they did and why they would say the things they did. So it's almost looking into psychology, though definitely not anywhere near a psychology degree. Anyway, there was always part of me in the background that wanted to go into law school. There was quite a bit of trauma within my family in childhood, and so I started looking to that. And in order to make my parents happy and not become a waitress, I went to law school. And, everything just kind of snowballed from there.
Well, see, I feel like I have the opposite career track as you. I wanted to be a lawyer, and I really wanted to be a lawyer strictly because of the fact that I wanted to be what like a lawyer you saw on TV. And then when I realized you had to do all of that writing and the background work, it made me much less interested in being a lawyer. So that was a quick end to my dreams of being a lawyer. So I would have only liked to do the acting part of it, where you're yelling in the courtroom and something like you'd see on SVU. So, but yeah, thank you for those backgrounds here. And I want to kind of start out a little bit talking about the problem. And I think the introduction I did also paints a really negative picture. And I don't want to focus on just that today. I want to talk about some of the positive things that you see. That documentary has a person inside of it. She's done foster care for 20 years, and the kids love her. And they did a little interview at the end, and some of the kids said they want to, when they get old and they have this giant house, they want to move her in and get her vacations. And she really clearly cares about these kids. And so there's a lot of good that happened. But I also want to talk about some of the problems and what situations put kids in foster homes, and kind of what are some of the big issues you see right now. And I'm going to start this one off with Jennifer, if you talk a little bit more about the problem with connecting families, and kind of what your software does to help kind of overcome that.
Sure. So when kids are in foster care, there can be all kinds of different paths that are the goal can be various different paths, and that's something that we're not involved with. But what we do try to do is make sure that when a child goes into foster care, their connections are either maintained as much as possible or built out if they're not there. For example, in one case that I had been part of my learning before we launched our software, three girls in a major metropolitan area were taken into foster care. Those three girls thought they had two people in the world, their mother and their grandmother. And those two women were not able to care for them, and so they'd gone into foster care. When their case got to a specialist who was doing this work manually, that specialist dove in and found that they had over, I think it was 100 relatives in the greater metropolitan area. None of them knew these three girls existed. And they were there to reach out to them and take them in. And I think it was a third cousin that ended up adopting them. So that was one of the stories that I came across when I was learning about this. And I thought, well, that should happen for every child in foster care, whether they need in the end to be adopted or not, or whether they're going to go back home or whatever's going to happen. They should have that network. And if you're living in a metropolitan area and only think you have two relatives, but you have 100 or more,
Yeah.
something has gone awry. And so we have, as you mentioned, over 400,000 kids in foster care in this country at any given time. And 100,000 of those are available and waiting for adoption. And every year, 20,000 turn either 18 or 21, depending on the state, what age it is. But 20,000 leave foster care as legal adults with we've never given them that forever family they were promised. We've not provided what was promised when they were taken by the state. And so, welcome to adulthood. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, this fails miserably. And most of the public, that includes myself before I started learning about this, have this idea, even though we know better from our own lives, that once you turn 18, you're kind of good to go. Oh, there's no reason to worry about adopting a 17-and-a-half-year-old. He's almost done. He's almost clear. He won't need parents, so don't worry about it. And that, of course, if a person reflects on it a bit, is as far from the truth as you can get. We need that kind of support, whether it comes from biological parents or other types of parent figures. We all need that kind of support long into our adulthood. And these kids in foster care don't get it. And if you think about turning out 20,000 young adults a year who not only don't have that kind of support, but also had a childhood that didn't even give them a basic level of preparation, it's a recipe for disaster, both for them personally as well as for our communities. So it's just a lose-lose in many ways. So that's where we're going. We are not social workers that connect our kids, my organization. We don't pretend to know the right answer for any given case. What we're doing is saying there's everything good about building out connections around a child, even about knowing which connections are not safe. That's important to know. And there's many cases where our users, maybe dad's in prison and he's not available, and maybe he's also not safe, or maybe he's in prison on nonviolent reasons, but he's not available, of course, to care for the child. But he's still the child's dad. And whether or not he can or should play an active role, whether he should even have contact with that child, he's still the child's dad. And that can never change, even if he's legally adopted and has an adoptive dad who's wonderful. It's we currently cannot extract DNA from our cells. And so our perspective is this work that these specialists are doing for a tiny fraction of 1% of children in foster care ought to be available to every child in care that needs it. And so we're just trying to say this is a good thing to have available for social workers to have in their toolkit, to use whenever needed, which we think would be much of the time, and let's make it available. And that hopefully will bring down the water level on our social workers who are generally drowning. And so they are struggling to do a good job at a very, very hard task they've been asked to do. And if we can give them the time to breathe, the time to recover, the time to think, they can make good decisions, caring decisions, helpful decisions. But if we're having them running from court to home checks to paperwork to supervisor check-ins constantly, they don't have time to think, much less weigh risks and make good choices for the family and the child. And so the idea is if we support them with better tools, they're not spending their day clicking around the web trying to find a phone number for this uncle that we heard of. The phone number should appear, they call it, and they move forward. So that's our idea.
I love it. And I think it's so important to have people who maybe didn't start out in nonprofits or NGOs and have an outside perspective come in and help out with technology, because I think that's something I spent a lot of years in nonprofits, and from my experience, it's often lacking in tech. So hearing someone come in and do some technology that's going to help, I think, is really encouraging. And I think also when you talk about connecting these kids back to their families, that's something that I learned over the past week. And I think this is from someone who grew up in and out of different homes. I lived with different family members. It was not a standard childhood. And I've also worked in inner city nonprofits for 7-8 years and worked with families. And I still learned a lot this week when I started looking into the foster care system, and learned both, number one, how difficult it can be to add that whole layer on top of everything else you're going through. You're growing up in a low income part of the town. You have schools that might not be at the same level, and you don't know who to call mom or dad. That's just a whole nother level. No matter what I went through as a kid, I knew who my mom and dad were. And I also think that looking through this, I think being able to connect those kids back to their families is important. But I think it also depends on what kind of housing or what kind of situations they came from. And that's what I want to talk to you about a little bit, Renee, is being in these court systems here. Some of these kids, it's pretty clear when you see your mother murdered by someone else, that was a pretty clear indication of how they get there. But I think there's a lot of situations where I saw some issues of drug abuse from the parents. I saw some issues of mistreatment on smaller levels. So how do you actually decide from a legal perspective, not you personally, but the court systems, how do you decide who gets removed from those homes, and what's the process to get kids back into that a setting, whether it's with their families or with a foster family?
So there's a couple of initial points that I want to make, just to get everybody on the same page. So there is a process to a removal of a child, and the removal of a child does not necessarily mean they always immediately go into foster care. And I think there's some misunderstanding of that in the United States. And what the foster care system that we know of the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where there are the real nightmare stories, we've done a lot to change that. It's still not perfect. And just the removal of a child causes trauma. But I think we're starting to hear these horror stories because it's becoming public knowledge, and kind of like policing in America. For every 90 encounters that go correct, you're going to hear the 10 that are awful. So I think it's really important to start with the idea that there's obviously going to be automatic trauma on removing a child. That does not necessarily mean the system is broken. And kind of to your point earlier, what's going on when these don't make the cameras, it's not always necessarily bad. And we do see some very good cases. So back to your initial question, what happens? So usually there's a report made, and it will go to, in Virginia, in Alexandria County in Virginia, it's called DCHS. So that's what I will refer to as most of this. It's Department of Children and Family Services. Each county calls it something different. So the report goes into the department sends somebody to investigate. They can make the decision to bring the case in, to remove the children immediately, to leave the children in the home, but to continue looking at the case. If they decide to remove the children, that case goes before a judge within 24 hours to decide if removal was appropriate. There's then usually another hearing. So once that picks up, we go into a series of hearings. And I will tell you, in my position as a court-appointed special advocate, which is a very term of art thing, we just went through a case that was in the system for 3 years. I can't tell you how much that sucks for the kids, because that means there's no permanency. So, Ray, this goes back to your other point, which is the presumption of whether children are better off with their families first. In 2017, 18, 19, somewhere in there, the federal government stepped in and they passed this. It's called the Family First Services Prevention Act, something like that. Anyway, the focus is that children are really better off with their families, and that there is a trauma that results in removing kids in the first place. And we want children to be with their families because in the long run for mental health, that is better. So there's a focus now on what services can we provide to a family to keep that family intact. And even if we have to remove the child at first. So what happens now? When a child does go into foster care, the department will look and make a recommendation to a judge. They will also make a plan, and it's called a permanency plan. And that permanency plan will lay out what each parent needs to do in order to get the child back. And it will have what the child needs. So we have both kind of parts of the family working together towards a common goal. Now, there are alternate realities baked into each of this, where it's, hey, we've identified this relative placement. So if this doesn't work, then this kid goes here. The last preference is usually placing the child for adoption. Now, sometimes it has to get to that, but that's usually kind of last preference for most departments.
Good. Now, you talked about the permanency there. Can you talk just a little bit more? You said once kids get to 3 years, they are not in permanency. I don't know what that means as an outsider. So could you explain that a little bit more, that process and that meaning?
So in 3 years isn't quite correct. There are several timeframes that a court works with as you go through each month, and there are really hard deadlines. And again, all of this depends. Like any good lawyer, I will preface every single one of my responses, well, it depends. But this depends state to state, really. And I'm trying to remember the exact numbers for Virginia. After 18 months, if a child has been in foster care, it is no longer necessarily considered best for them to return to their home. And so then different decisions start to be made. And if you're in a courtroom, the parents' attorneys will start to get very anxious about that 18 months because assumptions change after a certain amount of time. So after 3 years, if the child has been out of their home, the goal is always to achieve permanency for the child. And that looks like a whole lot of different things. But after 3 years, there's kind of the idea that if we aren't getting this done at home, we need to get it done somewhere.
Gotcha. And you said, so basically after 18 months, I'm assuming that the assumption then at that point is if the parents can't get it figured out within 18 months, it's not as likely to happen. Is that correct?
It's probably not going to happen. And we're going to start to look at foster parents being able to step in, because a lot of times you do have foster parents who want to adopt.
Gotcha. And Jennifer, when you talk about kind of reuniting families, both of you, when we did a little bit of conversation about this before we came on the air, had talked about I don't want to say controversy because I'm not sure how big it actually is, but there's a disagreement about the way people should be reunited and how often they should be reunited. Can you talk a little bit? I know people hate both sides in an issue, but I'd like to hear if you could give a both sides of this issue and why people think that that should be a priority, or it may not be in the best interest of the children. I'm sure you can explain it much better than I could. So I'd love to hear your views on that.
Sure. Yeah. So, and just to clarify, Connect Our Kids does not do direct service. And so I, as a physicist, don't serve children directly, but we do serve enormous number of social workers and some lawyers and quite a few CASAs as well, the court-appointed special advocates. And we hear many, many stories from them. And so it can often be, it's not that there's a right answer, and the question is who's right. From my assessment, as a good scientist, I will rarely, if ever, say always or never.
Yeah.
And so what my current assessment is that if your parents can't raise you for whatever reason, it's a difficult situation. It's rarely 100% clear what should happen. Those parents rarely lose all value to you. The question is, can they raise you in the time that you have to be a child? Or does someone else need to start raising you? Because, as Renee points out, permanency is important, and a childhood moves on, and children grow way faster than our courts like to move, and so it's a really hard answer sometimes. I suspect that sometimes it's clear, but for example, we had a case recently that one of our users told us about, in which they had a child who had been with his mother. He remembered his mother. She went to prison when he was around 5 for a minor drug case. And somehow he ended up, she was convinced to give him up for adoption because this would be better for him. She did. Those adoptive parents moved out of state with him, ended up abusing him, and he ended up in foster care in a different state. And so 8 years or so have passed. He's a young teenager, but he knows he had a mother and she loved him. And now he's been through 8 years of people who apparently don't so much, and been disrupted adoption. He's back in foster care. And so one of our early users of our software got a hold of the software, got his case, and just started putting in what she knew. She ended up finding his biological mother back in the original state, called her up. She was out of prison, long out of prison, had told herself she's not a good mother. She should let that boy go. He's surely in better hands now. Meanwhile, he is not doing well because he knows he has a mother out there. And the folks who were raising him, didn't seem to care for him. So this social worker contacted the biological mother. She never wanted to lose him. And, but just made some mistakes in her life, obviously wasn't a perfect mother. The social worker sticks the kid, who's now a teenager, in her car and drives him to this other state for Thanksgiving last year. And they were able to spend Thanksgiving together. And so she's working through the legalities of how that should work out. The biological mother's no longer his legal mother. Is she going to readopt him? But you can see there where you have a difficult situation. Whether it's appropriate and she's fully recovered for him to live with her or not, I don't know. We don't require any privacy details to us. We provide software and tools and support. But that's a difficult situation. And what social workers, in my perspective, just as a citizen and a taxpayer and someone who's been learning a lot about this field, what I really want for social workers is to be able to spend their time and their emotional energy and for lawyers in the field as well, and CASAs. I want them to have their time and their emotional energy to figuring out how can we support this family and this child in the way that's best for them, because a perfect arrangement where two stable parents have a child and are able to raise that child with all the resources they need, that's not what we're working with in all or most of these cases. So what we need is people who can help, and what we at Connect Our Kids, our perspective is, we're not social workers, we can't make those decisions. What we can do is provide tools and resources to take advantage of what we do have, which is the information age, which is a technology age, where we can at least find phone numbers. We can find that biological mother who's in another state, no idea her child's been being abused, and get them back together, and let the social workers take it from there.
Right.
I
If
love
I
it.
can jump in on something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because what Jennifer said is just super important right there, is we need to be spending more time figuring out how we can support the family. And there's been a real push for that in the look at what is in the best interests of the child, and removing the lens of what we expect culturally. So is it in the best interest of a child to have two parents who are both working, or one is off and taking care, but they can afford everything? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that that's what's always going to happen. And that doesn't mean that it trumps the best interest. So I've seen many cases go through where the foster home is, to a mainstream view, a better circumstance, right? You have two parents, you have both functioning, they can afford everything in the world for this child. That doesn't mean it's in the best interest of the child. So there's been a real look, and a needed look, at how we support families, instead of and that blends into some of our cultural understandings. And in America, looking at what other cultures believe, and is that still in the best interest of the child, instead of what we expect a good childhood looks like.
Yeah. Well, and I think
can
one
also
of...
add,
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
well, I realized I didn't give the other side. You were looking for kind of the two side thing.
I was going to bring it up, but I figured you might come back around to it. So I'm glad I didn't have to bring it up here.
Yeah, come back around to it. So sometimes there is a perspective that the family is bad. And so why would we try to find more of them? This family is a bad family. They've done poorly. They've not taken care of this child in whatever ways, got them removed and into foster care. And so sometimes when we're training potential users, they're presenting this view to us. Why would even want to find more of this bad family? We need to kind of remove the child from that bad soil and replant them into better soil, and then they can grow and flourish. And again, caveating that I'm not a social worker, I don't work these cases directly. But one of the groups that does do this work said they think about it this way. Imagine your own family. Is, whoever you are, all of us, is there not that crazy uncle, that cousin that went sort of off somewhere and we're not quite sure what's going on? That's where the foster child is emerging. And that part of the family has been struggling, and you're not even maybe aware of it. And we're trying to find you. And so whether or not we're going to use the word bad, but the part of the family, the parents or the grandparents who were unable to raise that child safely and successfully, and the child's ended up in foster care, they've not been able to do what the foster care system was looking for them to do. The child's been removed. If we want to call that bad or not, is a separate argument. But it doesn't mean that 200 extended family members plus community connections, neighbors, teachers, coaches, they can't statistically all be bad. And even the ones that we might say are not safe for the child, that's still part of the child's story. And so we've started to do a lot of work around the story. And if you'll permit me, I'll have one more story that just really gets me on this. One of our earliest users, she had I think a 15 or 16-year-old boy. She was getting real worried. He'd been in foster care since he was a toddler. And his social worker was very worried he would age out with no one. His foster parents did care for him deeply, and he cared for them, but they weren't going to adopt him. She was very worried he would have no one when he turned 18. So she signed up to use our software early on to see what she could find. This teenager, had a story that he told himself. And the story was that he was thrown away, that he was trash. Because why else would he have been given away, as he understood it, by his parents, his biological family, as a toddler? He must have been so awful, even as a toddler, they couldn't stand him. And in the 12, 13 years since, he'd had no contact with anyone he was related to. So it's not a leap to think that a teenager will arrive at the conclusion that he was trash, that he was thrown away by his biological family. So his social worker started, with the help of our software, she did amazing work and reached out and found his paternal grandmother, his paternal aunt. It turned out his grandmother still had pictures of the boy as a toddler on her wall. And she loved him so much that even though she knew he was a teenager, this was what she had to hold on to. She also told the social worker that he was named for the family's hero. He was so valued when he was born. He was not trash. He was so valued. He was given the most important name in the family. Now, as the situation turns out in that family, or in that situation, it wasn't the right thing for him to move from the foster family's home. He stayed with the foster family. The grandmother and the aunt were still not able to care for him. But the connection with them and the stories that they gave him completely changed his internal outlook of himself, his worth, his value, and why what happened to him happened. And that's priceless.
I mean, I love that. I think one of the things it was tough watching these documentaries because I think two things you said there really stuck out to me: value and family. And I think as someone who grew up being passed back and forth between family members, not outside, not in a foster system, but being in different family members, it's still something I struggle with today about feeling valued. And to have your entire family, whether the family chose it or whether the system chose it, but not being connected to them, I can't even begin to imagine the lack of value that we'd feel as a child that went through that. And I think the family part of it, there was one story in the documentary about a young woman. She was 18. She wanted to be a theater major, Renee. She was living with foster parents. She seemed like for what she went through, she seemed very well adjusted, very positive, very upbeat person. But she ended up at the end of the documentary living with a sister that she didn't know also got taken from her parents' house. And this was years after. But that connection with a sister that she hadn't seen basically her whole life became so important to her because it was a connection to that family. And it just made me think how deep those connections really lie. And there's all kinds of underlying psychological reasons for that. But feeling valued and feeling like you have a family and people can support you, I think that's the thing that really hit me the most while watching these and made me emotional watching them. But I do think on the positive side too, and I'm opening this up for either one of you here, but I think we always hear, and I think you guys have both brought this up, that there's always the bad stories that make the press. And it's, if you have one bad story out of 1,000 even, you're going to hear about the one bad story. And so we've always heard about bad foster parents, and we've heard that people are in it for the money and all of these things. But there were some really good foster parents I saw in here. And I think, do either of you have any experience with foster parents specifically? And again, it could be both sides of it, the bad you've seen, but I also want to hear about some of the good, because the older woman in the show, she basically wanted to have children and was only able to have one. So she started fostering, and now, the people in the resource centers are trying to find her and trying to always get people coming into her house, and she wants these kids. And it was really encouraging to see that. So do either of you have stories about some really good foster parents and maybe some of the whole experience of the good and the bad?
I mean, I will say that my own parents were foster parents, not to me, but there are a lot of very good people who are foster parents. And just to clear the air, because I know there are a lot of misconceptions, I think at least in Virginia, foster parents make maybe $500 a month per child, and a child gets an additional like $300 clothing and allowance annually. Nobody's getting rich on fostering these kids. In my work life for the National Center, we take a lot of referrals. I hear a lot of horror stories from the 70s and 80s still. It's not as much today, of kids saying, I was abused by my foster father. I will say every single foster parent that I've currently met, and that's in my personal life with knowing people who have done it or who are currently doing it, and in my professional life and as a CASA, the foster families I've seen are truly wonderful. They are there for the kids. A lot of times they almost get a little too involved in cases because they care so much about what is going to happen to this child. But it's not all sunshine and roses, because kind of like back to what I said at the beginning, even if you have a perfect foster family, there is going to be trauma, because the fact that the child had to be removed in the first place means there was a failure somewhere.
Yeah, and I can add one story that a user recently shared with us as well was of a foster family that wanted to adopt the I think probably preteen that they were fostering, and once they started moving towards that, he kind of reacted negatively, not because he didn't like them, but because the idea of this becoming permanent caused him to escalate his behaviors. It's a big step. And he also didn't understand what love looks like. And so they started to treat him like a real, like their son for life. And so we're going to do our homework because you have a future and it's important that you do well in school. And here's how we do well in school is we sit down and we study. And he considered that to be a negative thing. He'd never had parents do that for him. And so he ended up causing disruptions that ended up having him be removed from the home, not what the foster family wanted, but that's what happened. And over the course of the next couple placements, the similar situation occurred, and he started to realize he had had several good and caring foster parents, and they started to do the same thing. They wanted him to do his homework. They wanted him to do well. They were consistent in discipline and those kinds of caring things that are what love looks like. And a therapist got involved and helped him realize that first family that wanted to adopt him loved him. That's what that looks like. And so it took him some time to come to this realization. So his social worker then, getting these pieces together, said, well, that first family loved you. They wanted to adopt you. Do you want to go back and kind of see where they are now? They had since taken in other foster children. They were adopting another boy. But he did want to reach back out to them, and they still wanted him. And so even though he had caused such a disruption that he had to be removed from the home, or he had asked to be removed from the home, I don't know which, they still wanted him. And they had him come back to the home, and they adopted him. And, those are incredible human beings.
Yeah, I haven't seen foster care specifically, other than some of the kids we worked with through the nonprofit I worked at, but I have had a lot of people who adopted children, and seeing the love they have for them, it doesn't seem any different than what I see from parents who are by blood. But I do think you're talking about that kid, and I wonder if it's because if you decide you are going to be adopted, that's still a huge change. And it's almost like saying, I give up on ever getting reconnected to my birth family. And I'm not sure if that's what he went through, but that would be the thing that pops into my mind, is what is going through your head, realizing, hey, like maybe you're kind of hoping it's like the end of a movie and the parents come swooping back and say, we always loved you and we always want to be here for you. But that is a big change, and it's encouraging to see that they fought through that and still adopted the child. And one of the things that was really encouraging from that documentary, I wanted to try to see follow-up to see what happened with some of these families. And there was a kid, Dasani, he was the one in the show that had his mother's boyfriend had seen the murder. And I'm not real familiar with her songs, but there's a singer named Sia, and she's popular, and she apparently adopted Dasani after the documentary aired. So she hadn't talked about it for many years, but there were rumors and a lot of people talking about it, and she finally came out and said that yes, he was living with her. So I think that's great to see on a personal level. I think that, and it's great to see that this child was adopted by this famous person and probably is living a better life than he had. But at the same time, not all of us have the financial resources of Sia and the ability to do these kind of things. And not everyone can be like your parents, Renee, and be able to become foster parents. But I would like to hear, what could someone like, is there anything that someone like me could do? I can't be a foster parent at this point, and but I would love to be able to help in some way. Is there anything you guys can think of that average people who aren't doing this as a full-time job and a life change could do to be involved in the system and help make a change or help some of these kids?
I know that big brothers, big sisters across America are constantly looking for volunteers, and specifically men, importantly men. The program that I am part of, Court Appointed Special Advocate, here's the magic part of that. You don't have to be an attorney. In fact, they prefer you to not be an attorney, because whenever I step into that role, I have to take my attorney hat off. They are constantly looking for volunteers, and I will say it's maybe 10 to 20 hours a month. You have to go visit the kid twice to make sure that everything is safe, and then you write a report to the court. So you check everything in the child's life, you check and see what's going right. They are always, always, always looking for volunteers to step into that role, and that's one of the most direct ways that I can think of.
I would echo that. Those are both pretty substantial commitments, and rightly so. So for those who can't necessarily make that commitment, or at this time, we also find that educating yourself about the foster care system, like you did, Ray, watching the documentary, that can be painful to really go in deep like that. So even just understanding that these children and their situations are no fault of their own. It's not that they're deficient in some way, or they're the other. These are children just like the ones that anybody knows and loves, and their families just have had some trouble of various types. So become aware and educate those around you, just to know that what foster care is, what it means for a kid to be in foster care. It doesn't mean that they need to be kept separate. Of course, we are a nonprofit. We always take donations, but we find that the more people know what foster care is about, and the more that they are willing to be educated and talk to your colleagues, your coworkers, your neighbors, learn about it, helps. There's a stigma to foster care. So my co-founder, like I said, spent time with a foster family as a child. When I first met her, I met her because she married a friend of mine, and he knew I was learning about foster care. So he said, "Oh, I want you to meet Jennifer. She wants to know about your time in foster care." And my co-founder's name is Jessica. She says, "Oh, we don't talk about that. That's not okay. Like, we don't want anyone to know about that." That's her story to tell, but that's part of the problem, I think, is that our families and their ability to function, or lack of, we carry as shame. And so shame is a big part of this issue. We've touched on trauma, but I think shame fits in there as well. And to the extent that the individuals can learn more and understand more and become more compassionate around the idea that if someone grew up, whether formally in foster care or not in a traditional arrangement, that's not something for them to be ashamed of.
Yeah. Well, and I think the stigma, that's something that even I had my eyes open to. I mean, I have worked in some of these areas for a long time, and you like to think that, oh, I'm enlightened. I've gotten over this. I think that everyone should have the same abilities and should have the same opportunities. And I can see that people had struggles and worked through it, but there was something different. I think it goes back to what you said about having value and having family, and also that stigma to it, because I think I saw even the good mother in the documentary, the foster mother who was bringing her kids to the bus. One of the kids didn't want to get on the bus and just really was acting up. And I just kept thinking, well, what is happening to that child when she steps in the bus? Is she getting teased? I know how kids are. Kids are jerks. Like, I was a jerk. I'm still oftentimes a jerk. But when I was a kid, I was much more often a jerk. And you say things because people are different and there's a stigma there. And I think that's something that these kids live with. And I think that my defense mechanism throughout life has always been to say, it doesn't affect me. Whatever it is that bothered me, it doesn't affect me. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to mention it. I've overcome it. I'm strong enough. And these kids went through 100 times worse what I went through. And you start building that up and start keeping that inside. And I think that's one thing that I think we're lacking in general in society is therapy. I finally did it 2 years ago for the first time in my life because I was too strong. I didn't need it. I worked through things on my own, and it was so helpful. And these kids, that was one of the kids in the show. They were talking to him about going to therapy, and one of the dads who had a girlfriend who was on drugs while she was pregnant with their baby, he didn't want to go. He was like, I'm too tough to go to therapy. And I think that's something that there's a stigma with kids who have been in the foster care system. There's a stigma around therapy. There's a stigma around anyone moving around. Like if a new kid comes to your school, there's all these stigmas, and I feel like they're all wrapped up onto these kids. And I think one of the things that can help with that, and one of the things I've seen in my life personally, is mentorship. And I want to ask you maybe a controversial question, Renee. You mentioned that especially men in Big Brothers and Big Sisters aren't there. So there's the Big Sisters seem to be showing up. Why do you think other men, those big brothers, aren't showing up? Do you have any thoughts on that? And again, remember, I'm a guy, but I want to hear the truth. I don't want you to sugarcoat anything.
I think there are very good men out there. I think women tend to volunteer more. Actually, I know women volunteer more. So let me not say I think that women tend to. Women volunteer more. Women show up more. Women get into it more. I think men just don't think about it. I don't think it's a bad thing. I just don't think it crosses their mind. I think it's, a lot of men will do anything a neighbor asks. They will do anything, but kind of a structured volunteer assignment is like, what is that? I think women are just more empathetic. I think we know that. And we just tend to show up and get things done. It's so important to have male role models. And I genuinely believe men just don't realize that there's a lack there. Like, it's not even like, hey, I don't want to do it. It's, is there a problem? And there's just not a realization. But in the CASA program, I volunteer at the local children's hospital. I did that in Pittsburgh. I do it here in DC. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, it's always 90% women are showing up.
All right. Well, I just did a Google search, being attacked like you just attacked me. And it seems
you
like
should feel attacked, right?
I should. I think there's definitely a reality of that, because I think there's, in the experience I had with the nonprofits I worked at, there was a higher percentage of women that volunteered. Overall, the stats seem to be, from my cursory research, looks like 40% of women have volunteered, 35% of men, but it seems like women tend to be more active in it. So you are right, and I am offended, but I think this is a call to all the men listening to this episode to start volunteering. And it's, quite honestly, it's something that I haven't done in about a year and a half. It's been busy with work and other things, and I keep making these excuses, but it's also something that consistently comes back into my life of, wow, like, why am I not doing this? I gained so much from it. It's not about helping someone else. It's about giving whatever knowledge you can to someone, and also what you gain from it. And just this week, actually, there was a kid I worked with about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer than that now, 7 or 8 years ago. He was in a church that I went to, and he was, we volunteered with him. We always took kids to these wing nights and brought all these guys together, and he always came out with us, and he's now in law school at the University of Pittsburgh, just like you were, Renee. So, and he wanted to catch up. He's back in the city, and we're going to get some dinner next week. But that kind of stuff, it's so powerful for me. And this is my pitch to all the men out there. It's so powerful to think, you know what, no matter what I went through, and I think that's the part that's sometimes a struggle for men. I think I 100% hear what you're saying. And I think that women do have things difficult. And I think the thing that doesn't get talked a lot about with men is the fact that we often feel like we're not good enough in general. And it feels like if we don't feel good about how we are or who we are, how are we ever going to give that to someone else? And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. And I think that could be done through therapy in a lot of other ways. But everyone has something to give. And when you start giving, you get a lot back. And like I said, those connections that I made through my nonprofit experience are life-changing for me. And hopefully there's some good that comes to the kids as well.
Let me emphasize with kids. A lot of people think I didn't go through what they went through. I have no idea. I have nothing in common with them. And I will tell you, I have a 16-year-old little sister who we are completely different. What kids care about is time. She will come spend weeks with me, and we have nothing in common, but we still have a good time. Kids care about time. Kids care about love. They remember both of those things, time and love. So just spending the time, taking the time means more to a kid than what you talked about on that day.
Yeah, and I think that time, I think that's anyone thinking about volunteering. I think there's a lot of time can be an excuse, but it also can be a reason. And I think we should use it as the reason to do this.
It's never nearly as much time as you think, and it's always 10 times more rewarding. If it's 2 hours on a Saturday, what else were you going to do?
Yeah, and in the last episode, we did an episode about literacy, and we talked about some of the volunteers and some of the connections you see when you work here. Women who are 70 years old and volunteering with kids who are 15 years old that just really, they love, and I think I mentioned this on the last episode, they loved that they spent time with them. They loved that they felt valued, and that's really what it's all about. And so even those people who don't think they're cool, none of us really do, unless you're kind of a narcissist. Everyone kind of thinks we're worse off than what we actually are, and there's always a reason not to. And I think a lot of it comes back to not feeling good enough. But any time you can spend, anything you can give back is valuable. I want to wrap up kind of by asking what's next. I'm going to ask each of you this. I'm going to start out with you, Jennifer, but what's next? And that could either mean what can be improved in the system. It could be we already kind of have the call to arms now for people to volunteer, and I want to stress that one more time, but what can be improved about the system? What do you think's next? Anything else you want to kind of wrap up with? So Jennifer, we'll start with you.
That's just a simple little question. I'm sure I have a clear and concise answer. What can be improved about the system? Certainly many things. I guess we try to stay focused in our work on how can we put easy to use, useful tools in the hands of social workers, because the social workers, if a family comes into contact with child welfare, the social worker is going to be key. It's going to be key that they make a good decision in the first place about whether this case needs to even be continued or whether the family just needs, food help. It's crucial that they make a good and thoughtful decision about whether the child needs to be removed or not, and all the rest that Renee walked us through. So all the tools, we have a small set of tools that we're growing. They're all aimed around how can we give that social worker time to make good and quality decisions, to feel that they are helping children and families, which is what most of them went into social work to do. And unfortunately, that the field has this huge turnover rate because people, if you can imagine, people who want to help going into a field and finding that instead of often of doing the helping they wanted to do, they're spending a lot of time doing paperwork and sitting in court waiting for their turn and not really helping. That's a recipe for losing people from the field. We're also moving into how can we trauma is a hard thing, and you talked about therapy and the crucial aspect of that. But not everyone is able to go to therapy, even if they want to. Healthcare obviously is a huge issue, and that's a whole other podcast I'm sure that you have teed up. But if you can't get to therapy for whatever reason, can we at least open the idea of trauma to you? And so we're taking our first baby step around that with we have a video series that we're releasing, should be ready in the next month or two, to open the eyes of those who've either been in foster care or experienced it or even had secondary trauma from working with kids in and around foster care. And it's just a simple little series of what we're calling gaming quality videos. It's not a video game. It's like those little videos you see in the game, aimed at the youth and young adults, that says, hey, trauma's a real thing. It's not a character flaw. And you've probably experienced trauma, and this is what it's about. And this is what, these are some steps you can start to take to think about how to heal. It's like trying to run on a broken leg. It doesn't work. And if you look around, you see all your peers running, and you're trying to run, but you keep falling down. If you don't realize your leg is broken, you're going to think there's something wrong with you, that you're just a bad runner and you're just going to keep failing because you must be a bad runner. If you say, wait, I have a broken leg, stop trying to run on that broken leg till we get it healed. If you can take the steps to heal it, you can run just like everyone else. So, so those are some things that are next, kind of more for us. I think what's next broadly in the child welfare space is that we as a community, as citizenry, I think we need to take that bigger look that Renee was starting to walk us through around the 70s, 80s. We're evolving. I think we're still not there. One of the things that I find really frustrating is, but I do agree that we're getting things are, many things are improving. One of the things I find so frustrating is that children in foster care are the very definition of voiceless. So because it's just the way we humans operate, the laws that get passed and the money that gets distributed is often done to people with the loudest voices. And children, the legal voice of a child is their parents. And if you don't have parents and you're a child, you have no voice legally. And so those who speak for foster children are sort of in an already more difficult situation. So I don't know, I don't have the answer to that, but I think a real hard look at how we as a citizenry, how we address this wicked problem of how to raise children whose parents can't or won't raise them. It's not a simple, easy answer. And I don't think that we've really reflected on that enough as a citizenry about how we're going to do that and how we're going to equip the people that we hand this problem to. We really haven't done that well. And the software that we built, just as a quick example, replaces paper and pencil for many social workers. Wow. And that's just not okay.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think you did a great job of a very open-ended question, summarizing it in a good way there. And I think what you said actually just really hit me. The legal voice of a child is a parent, and if you have no parents, you have no legal voice, and I think that's powerful. So, thank you for that, Renee. Same question, very broad. See if you can narrow it down and give us what's going to solve all these problems. I'm going to actually go a little bit further for you since I've known you a little bit longer. What one thing can we do to solve all of the problems in the foster care system? It's your turn to solve this.
So here's a depressing answer. Nothing.
All right.
We are making steps. We are making huge steps. But like anything, this is a system that is reliant on individuals. Yeah. And it's reliant on individuals stepping up. And whether it's volunteers, which we talked about, or the professionals that we put in place doing their jobs. And it's very hard to control or to predict how individuals are going to react. As Jennifer said, folks burn out. They are overworked as it is. This system also is dependent on several other systems, like the mental health care system in America, like healthcare for mothers, like supports that we put in for the welfare system for families. So until all of those things align, there's no way to just fix the foster system. Because again, like I said very early, the foster system only comes into play because there's been a failure everywhere else. So you're starting at failure, which is not a strong place to get started. I will say there are a lot of good people in the system who are trying. Social workers are one. Ray, you and I talked about this, and I promised that I would explain it. Children actually in the foster system do have a legal representative. It's called the guardian ad litem. Parents get their own lawyers, and the child gets a lawyer, and that lawyer is the GAL, the guardian ad litem, who will step in for the child. I've met several. They are wonderful. Again, we're relying on an individual there that doesn't get paid a whole lot of money by the system. They are always attorneys, and they are always attorneys who don't get paid well and have 20 cases at any given time that are open active cases. So until we figure out a way to fix everything else, God, I hate to sound so defeatist about
Yeah,
this, but
I
I
mean,
think
that's a
the
terrible way to
foster
end
care.
this podcast. Jeez,
It
Renee.
is, and
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
Wow.
I think that it's the rough truth is that we're making the improvements that we can. For the kids that are in foster care, the best we can hope is that they're in a good, safe home, because we know they're starting with trauma, but until we can fix every other system, and America does not like to do policy deep fixes. America loves itself a good Band-Aid.
Yeah.
So until we stop slapping the Band-Aids on everything, I don't know how we fix this. The best we could do is small individual fixes and hope in the long run that turns things around.
Well, it
But I guess
sounds like, oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I was just going to add, I agree with everything Renee said, but and this is not the big fix, but I do think America has a long history of community and family, and so that's kind of the approach we're taking. We recognize we're not solving all problems, we're not curing world hunger and all of that, but I think if we were able to better empower communities and families, recognizing we will probably never solve all of these healthcare and poverty issues and issues of unfairness and other issues, but if we can empower the communities and the families with some guidance around making sure those who are empowered are healthy and supportive, we can often let families solve their problems to a certain extent. We can empower families, and by family, I'm including the broader family, the neighbors, the teachers, the coaches. Let them help. Let them know their help is needed. Like you were talking about with men volunteering, let them know their help is needed. One of our users recently connected a teenage girl back to her third or fifth grade basketball coach because she said that fifth grade basketball coach, I really looked up to him. I really liked him. I would like to live with him and his family. And they had to track him down. He was in a whole different school district. Called him up and said, "You're needed. Remember this girl? You coached her 5 years ago? She said you matter." And he said, "What?" Can you imagine being a basketball coach of an elementary school girls basketball team, and years later, one of those girls is a teenager and said you mattered. You mattered so much that she wondered if she could live with you because she needs a place to live. Holy cow, that guy stepped up, and they're adopting her now. And so these problems can't be solved wholesale with the ones and twos. But if you ask people to help and tell them they matter, because they do, because they were named, because they were asked, because they have a connection, people step up. But the thing is that takes a little bit of work. So I think, and I would say and this is easier to say than to do, but the one thing I would change to fix many problems in foster care is that the guiding principle should be that every child in foster care should be treated like they're a child that you love. That whatever you would imagine a child that you love and care about, what you would imagine you want happening for them if somehow they ended up in foster care, that's how every child in foster care should be treated. Every decision should be made with that thought in mind. And of course, there's good people working in this space, as Renee said. They're doing their best, but we're not giving them the room to be able to think and make those decisions. We're not giving them the resources to say, what is the very best thing we can do for this child who's in a difficult situation? What is the very best efforts that we can make to surround this child with all the people who might love and care for them, and then see what team we can put together? That's what I would want to have happen. And we're not doing it because we're not allowing our social workers and our family lawyers and our CASAs, we're not giving them that bandwidth and those resources. So if we can at least work towards saying, let's empower the people who can make that difference, and then make sure that they're able to surround those children and families with teams of people who do care and who can help them and who will step up. 95% of people, I bet, I'm just making this up. I bet 95% of Americans, if you said you personally matter to somebody who's in trouble, will you step up and help? And the ask is something that's possible for them to do. I bet they would do it.
I love it.
But
I
when
think we started out with me kind of bringing the mood down. Renee brought it back up. And then towards the end, I feel like Renee brought it back down. But now we're ending on a good note here. But I do think both of you, you focused in on community. And I think there's a couple things here. I think I agree with you, Renee, about how government is always about Band-Aids. I think ripping off the Band-Aid would be a great podcast episode someday. And I agree 100% with therapy, Jennifer. I think that's something that we also need to talk about in the healthcare system. It's so hard to get good care. But I do think that we've always been very good in America with community and with family and making it a broader personal interaction. And even looking back at my life, I had a grandfather who was so important to me as a child. And as I grew, I can pull 3 people very specifically that are still mentors of mine that I don't know where I'd be without them. And then there's a whole broader level of people who helped my life. But there's 4 main mentors in my life, and one of them was family, and 3 of them were the broader family, and they've become family. And so I think it's so important, and I think that's a great way to wrap this up, is to talk about just how we can do better as a society. And I think that really is when you come down to I didn't plan on this before I asked you that very broad question, but I think we really just got to live up to all of our expectations of living in a society. We have so many opportunities out there to volunteer. Big Brothers and Big Sisters is one, but there's so many local organizations that you can work with. Just get involved. I think that is something that when you distill all that we've talked about, being involved in these kids' lives makes such a huge difference. And I've seen it firsthand. You guys have seen it firsthand. And I think that that's a great positive way to end it. And you've solved all the world's problems. So great job, Jennifer and Renee. So
you're welcome. We're available anytime.
Perfect. I mean, we'll bring you back on. You mentioned world hunger. We'll bring you back on for that episode, and then you guys can solve that as well. But I want to thank you both for being here. Make sure you check out Connect Our Kids, check out the National Center for Victims of Crime. And also, if you want to learn more about this, as Jennifer said, there's a great documentary, Foster, on HBO. There's a series called Removed on YouTube, and that's more of a dramatization of journals that kids had made. And that one, I made it through one episode, and be honest, I couldn't watch it anymore. I think the dramatization, even though I knew it was a dramatization, I saw some things in there that reminded me of some of my childhood, and it was too hard to watch. And so I think seeing that documentary and that series will be really helpful. We'll also have some other links on the website at researchnews.com. And make sure you share this podcast, go out there and volunteer, and start helping some of these kids who are in our foster care system. So we'll be back again with a new episode soon, and we thank you for listening.